Imagine this. It's midnight. A royal palace. Suddenly, the most powerful king in the world bursts into his wife's chamber, completely naked, eyes burning with madness. The queen screams. But what happens next is a secret history tried to erase. For 2 centuries, everyone called George III the Mad King, the lunatic who lost America and went insane. But tonight, I'm revealing the truth the history books never dared to tell. A hidden story of royal torture, medical betrayal, and a mystery so dark it nearly destroyed a dynasty. What if everything you know is wrong? What if the real monster wasn't madness, but the very people sworn to heal him? Are you ready to uncover the evidence they buried for 200 years? Stay with me, because once you learn the truth about the Mad King, you'll never look at royalty, mental illness, or the history of medicine the same way again. This is not just another scandal. This is the darkest royal cover-up you've never heard. Question is, will you dare to watch till the end and face the truth they tried to hide? Forget everything Hollywood told you about the Mad King. Before madness, before the scandals, there was a royal love story so real it shocked Europe. Picture this. Chapel Royal, September 8, 1761. George is just 22, a young man about to marry a woman he'd never laid eyes on until hours before. Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, fresh off the boat from Germany, nervous, surrounded by strangers, steps into the ceremony. The court expects another cold, political arrangement. But what happens next defies centuries of royal tradition. In a moment no one expects, George and Charlotte connect. Truly, instantly. They fall for each other, not in secret, but openly, in front of the whole royal family. Over the next 28 years, they become Britain's great love match. Not just husband and wife, but partners, laughing, bickering, and raising a dozen children under the same roof. Unlike the kings before him, who treated mistresses like trophies, George was fiercely loyal. Not once did he betray Charlotte. Imagine the scene most evenings. The king, flute in hand. The queen, at her harpsichord. Their music drifting through the candlelit corridors of Windsor Castle, echoing with the ordinary warmth of family. Far from the icy splendor of European courts. Courtiers would pause in the halls, listening to this gentle human sound. The royal couple, lost in harmony. It's easy to forget now, but the people adored him. They called him Farmer George. A king more at home in muddy fields than gilded palaces. He poured his energy into agriculture, science, and real progress, transforming the royal estates not just for show but for the future. While other monarchs wasted fortunes on decadence, George built the Royal Academy of Arts, founded an observatory, and amassed one of the world's greatest libraries. He was the first of his dynasty to be born in Britain, to speak English as his first language, to feel truly part of his own country. He debated philosophy with scholars, joked with farmers, and for decades ruled not by fear or extravagance, but by genuine moral character. Britain flourished. Foreign ambassadors called it a miracle. A royal marriage that was, for once, both stable and happy. But beneath this golden surface, history's darkest storm was quietly gathering, waiting to explode. June 1788. Cheltenham Spa. Picture a royal postcard. King George and Queen Charlotte strolling through sunlit gardens, children's laughter filling the air, the perfect image of happiness. But behind the smiles, something is unraveling. If you watched closely, you'd notice it first in George's eyes. Restless, gleaming with a strange energy. He talks constantly, words tumbling out so fast his family can barely keep up. The Queen, always graceful, starts to look anxious, half jogging just to match his pace. By evening he's still going, jumping from astronomy to politics to farming, barely pausing for breath. His secretaries, exhausted, swap shifts trying to keep up with the deluge of royal letters. Pages and pages, sentences running wild, ideas spilling faster than ink can dry. When the royal family returns to Windsor in August, the pace only intensifies. George throws himself into his duties with a manic fury. Dawn to midnight, every day. And yet something is wrong. By October his health collapses. Agonizing stomach pain, relentless vomiting, legs swelling grotesquely, eyes jaundiced yellow. Angry red rashes blossom across his skin, shocking his daughters. The physical agony is only the beginning. The behavior turns terrifying. Night after night, George storms naked through palace corridors, bursting into rooms with a wildness that chills even the bravest courtiers. He makes advances that leave everyone, servants, daughters, even Queen Charlotte herself, horrified and helpless. Then comes the night everything shatters. October 17, 1788. The family is gathered for dinner. The king, voice rising, rambles for hours, lost in a storm of politics and policy. The Prince of Wales, desperate, tries to steer the conversation elsewhere. But suddenly George explodes. In a fit of fury, he leaps from his chair, grabs his eldest son by the throat, and slams him to the marble floor, right in front of his wife and daughters. The impact echoes like a gunshot. Silence falls. Tears, shock, and fear freeze the room. That night, something breaks in the royal household. George, once gentle and loving, has become someone dangerous, a stranger to his own family. In terror and desperation, Queen Charlotte makes a decision she will regret for the rest of her life. She sends for a doctor. December 5, 1788. The gates of Kew Palace creak open as a battered carriage rumbles in, carrying a figure who would forever haunt royal history. Dr. Francis Willis, an elderly man with a priest's demeanor and a stare as cold as winter steel. He surveys the palace like a conqueror, his presence sending a shiver through the halls. Willis isn't the doctor of legend. Once a country clergyman, he found his fortune in madness, running a private asylum and boasting of his moral method, a system designed not to heal but to dominate. For George, this meeting is a prelude to torment. Even in his manic haze, the king senses danger. "I'm sorry for it," George whispers, voice trembling. "You have quit a profession I always loved and embraced one I most heartily detest." Willis responds with icy conviction. "Our Savior himself went about healing the sick." George, with the last flicker of wit he'd show for years, shoots back. "Yes, but he had not £700 a year for it." The joke dies quickly. Darkness follows. Willis's philosophy is simple and brutal. Mental illness is just an overexcited brain. The solution: break the will, bend the mind, force the king to obey, not recover. Willis's methods arrive in waves of horror. Strapped into straitjackets for hours. Blistering mustard poultices, rubbed into George's scalp until the skin swells and erupts. Bleeding. Misses. Over 2,000 enemas in 6 months. Every day, George swallows emetic tartar, a so-called remedy laced with deadly arsenic. Charlotte is cut off, forbidden to see her husband, left only with Willis's sanitized reports, while George wastes away in loneliness and agony. But Willis saves his true masterpiece for last: the therapeutic restraint system. To the untrained eye, it's just a wooden chair. Look closer and you'll see it's a throne of torture. Thick leather straps, iron clamps, an integrated straitjacket. Willis calls it therapeutic. George, broken and humiliated, calls it his coronation throne. The breaking begins. In the first week, George fights like a caged animal, screaming until his voice is gone. By week 4 he pleads for mercy. By week 12 silence, compliance beaten into his soul. The King of England, reduced to tears and nothingness. Meanwhile, just beyond the walls, Charlotte listens to her husband's screams, powerless to help. For a moment, it seemed the nightmare was over. In February 1789, George's mind cleared, the natural cycle of his illness bringing a fragile peace. Dr. Willis, ever the opportunist, took full credit and basked in the nation's gratitude. The king was back. Loving husband, devoted father, a glimmer of hope restored. For 12 fleeting years, the royal family tasted normalcy again. But the truth was never far. The Willis family had planted roots, ready to return at the first sign of trouble. When political tensions over Catholic emancipation ignited George's relapse in 1801, The response inside the palace was heartbreakingly resigned. Charlotte didn't plead, didn't fight. She locked her bedroom, kept the king away, surrendered to fate. The children learned to accept their father's disappearances into medical hell. This was learned helplessness, not just for George but for everyone who loved him. Now it was the sons, John and Robert Willis, who refined their father's legacy of suffering. The restraint chair evolved. Extra head clamps, heavier leather, longer hours, 8, 10, sometimes 12 a day. George's skin developed open sores, never given time to heal. The king, once revered as the gold standard of British monarchy, was reduced to an experiment in cruelty, trapped, degraded, and isolated. But in 1804, horror escalated. The king's mania, fueled by poisoning and abuse, mutated into something the family could barely comprehend. The violence became sexual, brutal, unpredictable. He assaulted his eldest daughter, even his daughter-in-law. The family, terrified, built a fortress within the palace. Women never left alone with the king, doors locked, secret escape routes mapped out. The royal household lived under siege, not from foreign enemies, but from their own patriarch, broken by treatment. And all the while, the Willis family profited. The government paid them handsomely to maintain the illusion of care. Each relapse threatened a national crisis about regency. Each time, Willis provided whatever diagnosis best served those in power. George's suffering was political currency. For the family, hope itself became a form of cruelty. Every recovery meant getting their father and husband back, only to lose him again, deeper and darker with each cycle. The children lost their childhoods to fear, trapped in a cycle that left scars no crown could heal. And through it all, the Willis methods remained unchanged. Because what mattered most was control, not compassion. What makes the tragedy of George III so chilling is not just what was done to him, but what his family never knew. Every single day, the Willis dynasty administered their cures, medicine laced with poisons, emetic tartar loaded with arsenic, mercury compounds, deadly in their effect. These weren't treatments. They were slow, relentless executions, transforming a manageable illness into a 30-year descent into hell. The toxins built up in the king's body, damaging his nervous system, corroding his mind. Each relapse grew more violent, more unrecognizable, not just because of the natural progression of his bipolar disorder, but because of what was being forced into his veins. The king's condition, once treatable, became a monstrous blend of suffering, part illness, part iatrogenic torture. What should have been a story of medical hope became a warning for the ages. By 1810, the royal family was on the edge. Princess Amelia, George's youngest and dearest child, was dying of tuberculosis at just 27. For weeks, the king sat at her bedside, shattered, unable to save the daughter he loved most. When Amelia finally died in November, something inside George broke for good. This was more than a manic episode. This was grief weaponized by decades of abuse. His body ruined, his mind battered, his spirit finally crushed. Within days, the Willis brothers descended on Windsor one last time, bringing their instruments of restraint and therapy. George recognized them instantly, and with a desperation that pierced even the coldest heart, begged his family, "No Willis family members are to be placed about me." But his plea was ignored. Politics demanded a puppet king. The doctors were given free rein. The last decade of George's life is a study in horror. For 12 hours a day, he was strapped into his coronation chair, forced into straitjackets, denied dignity and hope. When he refused to eat, they force-fed him like livestock. Charlotte, devastated beyond words, stopped visiting altogether, unable to face the wreckage of the man she'd loved. Even his children, haunted by trauma, could only watch from afar. In these final years, George's mind collapsed into fantasy. He spoke to his dead daughter, held imaginary court, crowned himself with invisible crowns. The man who once ruled an empire now wandered a ghostly prison, abandoned, broken, and poisoned by those sworn to heal him. As the years dragged on, Windsor Castle became less a palace and more a tomb. The king's condition horrified everyone who saw it. George wasted away, skeletal and wild-bearded, his royal robes hanging from his shrinking frame. Servants begged to be transferred, unable to endure the constant screams and the haunted silence that followed. Guards turned to drink, traumatized by the sight of a monarch unraveling before their eyes. George's mind spun further into delusion. He held lengthy conversations with Princess Amelia, describing her funeral as if she were still beside him. He believed he was dead or at times king of an imaginary court. He performed rituals and crowned himself with invisible jewels, signing proclamations with ink that didn't exist. At rare moments of lucidity, the awareness hit him. He understood he was trapped in a nightmare with no escape. While Britain fought the Napoleonic Wars and the empire changed forever, its king was absent, lost in madness and solitude. Political necessity hid the truth. Reports assured the world that the king was stable. Decisions were being made. But in reality, George was shut away. His reality fractured beyond repair. January 29, 1820. George III's heart finally gave out. His last words, heartbreakingly simple, were for "my dear Charlotte," not knowing she died 2 years before. He died believing he was preparing for his son's coronation, unaware that his own reign had faded into darkness long ago. But the truth, buried for 2 centuries, would not stay hidden forever. Fast forward to 2013. Professor Peter Gard sits at his desk in St. George's University, feeding 500 of George's handwritten letters into an advanced AI analysis program. What the computer finds is staggering. During the king's mad periods, his sentence length skyrocketed, his vocabulary becoming more creative, not less. His writings weren't the gibberish of insanity, they were textbook signs of modern bipolar disorder, specifically the manic phase. Even forensic analysis of George's hair told the same story. Arsenic levels 5 times higher than normal, peaking during his worst episodes. The king wasn't born mad. He was poisoned by the very people paid to heal him. His mind shattered not just by illness, but by greed and ignorance masquerading as medicine. With the digital evidence laid bare, history itself was forced to confess. George III wasn't the mad king of legend, but the tortured king, destroyed by ignorance, arrogance, and the so-called healers who profited from his pain. The handwriting analysis exposed everything. George's script, once steady and bold, became shaky and broken in direct step with his poisoning. The infamous blue urine that Dr. Willis had paraded as proof of genetic madness. A single cherry-picked sample, while others were perfectly normal. Every thread of the old story unraveled. Today, medical historians agree. George III suffered from classic bipolar disorder, made catastrophic by mercury and arsenic treatments. His tormentors would be tried for assault and battery by modern standards. But here's what truly haunts. This was a king, a man with all the power, wealth, and prestige the world could offer, made helpless by the very people meant to protect him. Mental illness, it turns out, spares no one. It doesn't care about crowns, bank accounts, or titles. The disorder that shattered George's life is treatable today. Lithium antipsychotics and therapy have transformed millions of lives. The family trauma that broke Queen Charlotte and the royal children. Today we have counseling, support groups, and hope. But what about us? Will future generations look back in horror at our own blind spots, our own mistakes disguised as progress? How do we guard against arrogance in medicine, the same arrogance that turned a king's palace into a chamber of horrors? George III's real legacy isn't the loss of America, or the myth of royal madness. It's a cautionary tale, of a brilliant, curious man failed by those who should have cared most, of a queen whose loyalty endured the impossible, of children who survived a nightmare that even fairy tales can't contain. His story is a plea for empathy, for those struggling with invisible battles, no matter their station. So if this truth moved you, share it. Let the story of George III remind us, behind every crown or every ordinary face, is a human heart, vulnerable and deserving of dignity. Remember him not as the mad king, but as the king who was failed by history, and whose suffering taught us what true compassion must look like.